Part 1. The Quiet Start. I didn't expect much when I signed up for a simple tour of the old mansion on Elm Street. It was said to be abandoned, left to rot in a town that had long forgotten it. But there was something about the place, the history, the faded grandeur that drew me in. They say curiosity killed the cat, but in my case, it wasn't curiosity. It was boredom. I'd recently moved to the area and I was looking for something to pass the time. A haunted house tour seemed like the perfect distraction. When we pulled up in front of the mansion, I was underwhelmed. The house was old, sure, and it was huge, more of a decaying castle than a home. The windows were boarded up, the roof sagging in places, and the front lawn was overgrown with weeds that seemed to have taken over everything. But it wasn't the dilapidation that caught my attention. It was the way the place felt, like it had a presence all its own. Something wasn't right, but I shrugged it off as a result of its sheer age. The tour guide, a local historian who had lived nearby his whole life, greeted us with a wide smile. He had the kind of overly enthusiastic energy that made it clear he didn't really believe in any of the haunted rumors surrounding the house. He started talking about the history, how the mansion was once a grand estate, home to a wealthy family who mysteriously vanished one night. No one knew what happened to them, and no one dared to ask. The house had stood empty for decades, though there were always whispers among the locals that something lingered in the shadows, something that shouldn't have. As the group moved inside, I felt the temperature drop, despite the warmth of the afternoon sun still shining outside. I figured it was just the chill of the old building. We walked through the foyer, which smelled like stale air and dust, our footsteps echoing through the empty hall. It was quiet, too quiet, and for some reason the silence felt suffocating, like the house was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. I didn't think much of it at first, but then I noticed something odd. Every time I looked at a particular spot in the hallway, the shadows seemed deeper, darker. I couldn't explain it, but it felt as though there was something, or someone, just outside my vision, lurking in the corners. A vague sense of being watched. It wasn't the kind of feeling you could easily dismiss, but again, I tried to ignore it. Then, the lights flickered. Part 2, Unseen Eyes. By the time we made it to the second floor, the house was beginning to feel more like a maze than a mansion. The tour guide rambled on about the mansion's history, but I couldn't focus on his words. The silence was pressing in on me, and the eerie feeling was growing stronger. It wasn't just the shadows that seemed to stretch unnaturally. It was the feeling of being followed. I glanced behind me, half expecting to see someone standing there, but no one was. I wasn't alone in the building, of course. There were a handful of other tourists with me, but it felt like I was. Every time I turned a corner, I felt something shift in the air, something unseen, just out of reach, something there. It wasn't until we reached the old ballroom that the real unease kicked in. The door creaked open, revealing a grand room that had clearly once been the heart of the mansion's social life. But now, it was just a hollow shell. The ornate chandeliers were long gone, and the once polished floors were covered in a thick layer of dust. Cobwebs hung from the high ceilings, and faded paintings of long-dead ancestors stared blankly from the walls. The air was thick, almost suffocating. It smelled stale, like a place that had been untouched for too long. The tour guide continued his story, describing how the ballroom had been the site of many elegant parties before the family's mysterious disappearance. But as he spoke, I couldn't shake the feeling that the room was wrong. Something about it made my stomach churn. It felt like the walls were closing in on us. And that's when I saw it. In the far corner of the room, barely visible in the dim light, a figure stood. At first I thought it was just a trick of the light, one of the shadows playing with my eyes. But when I looked again, I saw it more clearly. A tall, thin figure, dressed in dark clothes, standing perfectly still. It didn't move. It didn't speak. But the longer I stared, the more I felt an overwhelming sense of dread. I turned to the group, but no one else seemed to notice. They were all fixated on the tour guide, too engrossed in his story to notice the figure in the corner. I rubbed my eyes, thinking it was some trick of the light, but when I looked back, the figure was still there, watching us. I stepped forward, my heart pounding. But before I could get too close, the figure disappeared. No sudden movement, no sound, just gone. It was as if the air itself had swallowed it whole. I didn't know what to think. Was I imagining things? Was it the heat? Or something in the air, playing tricks on me? But the others hadn't seen it. No one had reacted. And when I looked around the room again, everything was the same, empty, still. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something had changed. The house felt alive now, more alive than I had ever felt it before. Part 3, the moment of truth. By the time we reached the final room, I felt like I was in a daze. The tour had gone on longer than I expected, and I was eager to get out. Every room had felt the same. Too quiet, too still, and always that sense of being watched. But the last room, the master bedroom, was where everything finally came to a head. The door creaked open, and we stepped inside. The room was large and grand, with high windows that let in the last bit of the evening light. The bed was an imposing 4-poster, draped with tattered curtains that barely hung on their rods. The floor was covered with old rugs, their colours faded with age, and the walls were lined with cracked mirrors. As we stepped inside, the air felt even colder, and I could feel the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. The sense of being watched had intensified to an almost suffocating level. I wanted to leave. I needed to leave. But it wasn't until I walked toward the bed that things took a darker turn. As I moved across the room, I noticed something in the mirror. I stopped, staring at the reflection, which seemed out of place. There was something or someone standing in the corner of the room, just out of sight in the reflection. But when I turned around, no one was there. I backed away from the mirror, panic flooding my chest. My heart was racing. I was no longer just uncomfortable, I was terrified. I couldn't explain it, but I felt as though the room was closing in on me, as if I was being surrounded by something I couldn't see but could feel creeping closer. And then the door slammed shut. I spun around, gasping. The others were still in the room, completely unaware of what had just happened, but the door was locked. There was no way out. The silence grew louder. The air became heavier. I could hear my heartbeat in my ears as I tried to make sense of the situation. And that's when I heard it. A voice, soft, barely audible, but unmistakably there, whispered in my ear, "You'll never leave." My blood ran cold. My legs were shaking. I tried to reach for the door, but I couldn't. My hands wouldn't stop trembling. I was trapped. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, the door clicked open. I stumbled out into the hallway, gasping for air, but I didn't look back. I didn't stop running until I was out of the mansion, breathless and shaken. I left that night, and I never went back. The mansion on Elm Street still stands, forgotten by most. But for those who have been inside, there's no forgetting. And I know that whatever it was, whatever I felt in that house, it's still there. Part 1. A Forbidden Place. It had been years since the last time I saw that place. The forgotten asylum was tucked away at the edge of town, surrounded by thick trees and overgrown fence that barely held its ground. I had heard stories about it, of course, everyone had. It was the kind of place you're told never to go near, the kind of place that draws kids like a magnet just to dare each other into venturing inside. But I never thought I'd end up there. I had been looking for something to take my mind off of everything, something to do on a quiet Saturday afternoon. And that's when my friend Jake brought it up. He knew about the asylum's history, and as we sat around, he casually mentioned that he had an old map of the property. It was abandoned, after all. What harm could there be? I'd heard the rumors, whispers of strange sounds in the night, of people going missing near the place, of the walls still echoing with the cries of those who once lived there. It wasn't a comfortable thought, but the idea of exploring it, even for just a few hours, felt like the thrill I was looking for. So we set out, leaving the town behind us and driving down a narrow, bumpy road that seemed to have been forgotten by time. The trees seemed to close in around us, their shadows stretching across the path like fingers reaching for the car. Finally, we arrived at the asylum. At first glance, it didn't look as menacing as I had imagined. The crumbling brick walls, the shattered windows, and the rusting iron gates seemed more sad than frightening. But there was something about the silence that pressed down on me, something about the way the wind felt wrong when it blew through the trees. We climbed over the broken fence and entered through an old, decaying door. The moment we stepped inside, it felt like the world outside had disappeared. The silence was deafening, but there was something alive in that silence. It was the kind of place that seemed to hold memories, not just in the walls, but in the very air. As we moved deeper into the asylum, I couldn't shake the feeling that we weren't alone. The hallways stretched out endlessly, dark and narrow, with old doors lining the walls. The floors creaked beneath our feet, and every shadow seemed to move. It wasn't just the emptiness of the place that unnerved me. It was the sense that we had entered something much darker. I pushed the thought aside and focused on exploring. But then the first strange thing happened. It wasn't much, just a soft thud, like something heavy had been dropped upstairs. I glanced at Jake, but he didn't seem to hear it. I took a step forward, but the feeling of being watched returned, stronger than ever. I couldn't help but think, this place isn't empty. Part 2. The first sign, we pressed on deeper into the asylum, and the further we went, the more the place seemed to shift. The air felt heavier with each step, like it was thicker than it should have been. We passed room after room, each one more decayed than the last. The walls were lined with old peeling paint, broken furniture scattered across the floors, and long-forgotten belongings that had once been the personal items of the residents. But it wasn't the decay that made me uneasy. It was the strange coldness that seemed to emanate from certain rooms. As we walked through a narrow hallway, I felt it again, like something was watching me, pressing down on me from all sides. Every time I turned a corner, I expected to see someone standing there, but nothing. Just the deep, unsettling silence. Jake was ahead of me, laughing at some old, worn-out paintings on the wall. But as I caught up to him, I heard something, a low, almost inaudible whisper. It was so faint I almost thought it was just the wind, but then I heard it again, clearer this time. "Help me." I stopped in my tracks. My stomach twisted in knots and a cold sweat broke out across my neck. I looked around, expecting to see someone, but no one was there. Jake turned to me, confused. "What's up? Did you hear that?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. "Hear what?" "That voice," I said. "I swear someone just said, 'Help me.'" Jake laughed. "You're probably just hearing things. It's probably just the wind. Come on, let's keep moving." But I couldn't shake the feeling. It wasn't the wind. It was something else. Something that wasn't supposed to be there. I followed Jake deeper into the building, but my senses were heightened now, every noise, every creak of the floorboards making my heart race faster. It wasn't just the silence that felt wrong. It was the presence of something unseen. And it was closer now. We reached the next hall, and I saw something that made my blood run cold. The door at the end of the hallway was open, but it wasn't supposed to be. I could have sworn it had been shut earlier. It was as if someone or something had opened it. I approached slowly, trying to ignore the panic creeping up my spine. As I stepped inside, the room felt wrong. There were remnants of old medical equipment, abandoned in a heap in the center. The walls were covered in strange markings, symbols, lines, scribbles that didn't make sense. And then, in the far corner of the room, I saw it. A chair. An old, worn-out chair facing the wall. But the hairs on my neck stood up because I could see it. The chair was moving, just slightly, but enough for me to see it, as if someone was sitting in it. I wasn't sure if I should move closer, but I couldn't help myself. I stepped forward, my legs shaking. The closer I got, the more the room seemed to pulse with something that shouldn't be here. I reached out, about to touch the back of the chair when I felt it, cold fingers brushing against my neck. I spun around, my heart hammering in my chest, but there was no one there. Part 3, the descent. We didn't stay in that room long. I don't know what made me run, but I grabbed Jake's arm and pulled him out of there, not saying a word. The whole time I could feel something chasing us, just out of reach. It was as if the walls themselves were alive, shifting and changing, making it harder for us to leave. The temperature dropped, and the air grew thick with a suffocating sense of dread. Every step we took seemed to echo in the empty halls, bouncing off the walls. I wanted to leave, but I didn't know how. The house was twisting, the hallways stretching in impossible directions like it had taken on a life of its own. Jake was starting to notice too. He kept looking over his shoulder, his breath coming out in quick, shallow gasps. He tried to make jokes, tried to keep things light, but I could see the fear in his eyes. And it wasn't just me. He could feel it too. We stumbled across an old elevator shaft, rusted and abandoned, but something about it felt wrong. The shaft was empty, but as we passed it, I swore I heard movement. Footsteps, dragging, something, or someone was inside. We ran past it, but I could feel its presence closing in behind us. Something was following us. The whispering started again, louder this time. Leave. We ran faster now, not stopping until we found the exit. I slammed my hands against the door, but it wouldn't open. We were trapped. The air was thick, suffocating. I could barely breathe as I tugged and pulled at the handle, feeling the walls press in around us. And then, just as suddenly as it had started, the door flew open, and we stumbled out into the cold night air. I didn't look back as we ran to the car, but I swear from the corner of my eye I saw someone, or something, watching us from the second-floor window. The forgotten asylum is still there, sitting in the woods, just as it always has. But it's not empty. Not anymore. It watches, and it waits. Part 1. The Volunteer. I had always wanted to do something meaningful with my time, so when a local volunteer organisation offered the chance to work at the old hospital on the outskirts of town, I jumped at the opportunity. The hospital had been closed for years, but it still had a kind of eerie reputation. It was said to be haunted, though I dismissed it as urban legend. After all, what could possibly be scary about an old building? I figured it would just be another part of the community's history, a place that needed some love and attention. The first day I stepped into the hospital, it seemed empty. Not just quiet, but void of life, like the building was waiting for something. The long, sterile hallways stretched endlessly in front of me, and the faint smell of antiseptic still lingered in the air. There was an oppressive weight in the air, something I couldn't quite place. But the volunteers and staff that had been working there for years seemed completely unfazed, laughing and chatting as they moved through the rooms. I was assigned to the third floor, a place that had been completely untouched since the hospital's closure. The windows were boarded up, and dust hung thick in the air. But it was clear that someone had gone through the effort to keep the place in decent condition. Still, there was something unsettling about it, like the walls were hiding something. I had the oddest feeling that something had happened here, something that was never talked about. As the first few hours passed, I started to feel it, an inexplicable coldness, even though the air conditioning was off. My breath fogged in front of me. Every now and then, I would hear the creak of a door or the faint sound of footsteps behind me. But when I turned around, there was no one there. It wasn't the kind of spooky feeling you'd expect from a ghost story. It was more like something just wasn't right. I chalked it up to nerves, but as the day went on, the feeling didn't subside. In fact, it grew stronger. Part 2. The movement in the dark. By the second day, things had gotten weirder. I had started to feel like I wasn't alone in the building. It was subtle at first, just a flicker of movement in my peripheral vision, or the sound of something being dropped from far away. But one evening, as I was working on organising medical records in a storage room, something made my heart skip a beat. The door at the far end of the room slammed shut on its own. The force of the slam was enough to make the walls vibrate. I jumped back, my breath catching in my throat, as I stood there frozen for a moment. My first instinct was to check the door, expecting the wind to be responsible, but there was no breeze. The air was still, and yet the door had slammed with force. I stood there for a few seconds, trying to convince myself that it was just some old mechanism acting up. But the longer I stood there, the more unsettled I became. The quiet of the room felt unnatural now, like something was waiting. I turned my attention back to the stacks of records, forcing myself to focus. But then it happened again. This time I was standing by the open window, glancing at the ground far below, when I heard it, a soft shuffle. I looked up, startled. Nothing. But then in the corner of my eye I saw movement. A figure. Just a blur, really. Moving quickly down the hall. I could feel my pulse quicken as I walked over to the door. My hand hovered over the handle, but something stopped me. I don't know why, but I couldn't bring myself to open it. Something told me not to. Instead, I just stood there, listening. The sound of footsteps had stopped, but I could feel the building pulse around me, like it was alive. My heart raced as I backed away from the door, suddenly aware of the fact that I wasn't alone. Part 3, the hidden room. By the time the sun set, I was a wreck. The shadows in the building had deepened, and I could feel something pressing in on me, something invisible and just out of reach. I had to get out, but I couldn't leave yet. The others were still working on the ground floor, and I couldn't bring myself to tell them about the odd things I had experienced, especially when I wasn't sure whether I was imagining it all. Still, something told me to get out of that building, and the feeling only grew stronger with every passing minute. Just as I was about to head toward the stairwell to leave, I heard something, a sound coming from the floor above. It wasn't just a sound, it was a voice. I froze. It was soft at first, barely audible, but it grew louder, becoming more distinct, almost like someone was trying to speak through the walls. The voice was raspy, as if it had been calling out for years. I couldn't make out the words, but I felt a deep, primal need to investigate. The hairs on the back of my neck stood on end. I climbed the stairs to the 4th floor, the one that had been locked for years, the one the others had warned me never to go near. As I pushed open the door, the temperature dropped immediately. I felt my breath turn cold as I stepped into the room. The floor was covered in dust, and the room was entirely empty. But the moment I stepped inside, I felt it, the presence. A thick, unnatural heaviness in the air. The walls seemed to close in on me, and the whispers began again. They came from the far corner of the room, where a faded old curtain covered something behind it. I took a few steps forward, the whispers growing louder with every inch. When I pulled back the curtain, my stomach twisted into a knot. There was a door, a hidden door. It wasn't big, just a small, plain wooden door, barely noticeable among the peeling paint and cracks in the wall, but it was there, and it was slightly ajar. I reached for the doorknob. The second I touched it, I felt the room shift. The air grew even colder, and the whispers became more urgent, louder. Leave, now. It was no longer a soft plea. It was a command. But I didn't leave. I opened the door. Beyond it was nothing but darkness. I stepped inside, my foot hitting something soft. I flicked on my flashlight, and that's when I saw it. The walls of the room were covered in old photographs. Photos of the hospital, yes, but also of the patients. And scattered throughout the photos were faces I didn't recognize, twisted, blurry faces, some too deformed to understand. But one face stood out, a woman, standing in the corner of every single photograph. Her eyes were hollow, empty, staring directly at me. And then the whispers stopped. The room went completely silent, and I heard it. A voice, clear and cold, echoing through my mind. You shouldn't have come. I turned around and ran, my heart pounding in my chest. The door slammed shut behind me, and I didn't look back. I haven't been back to the old hospital since. But the images, the whispers, they're still with me. And every time I close my eyes, I see her face, the woman who was never meant to be in those photos. It's easy to convince yourself that places like these are just forgotten relics of the past, spaces abandoned and left to fade away. But after hearing these stories, can you really still dismiss them? Can you look at an old building, an empty room, and not feel that heavy, suffocating presence, that invisible something lurking in the shadows? Sometimes, the most frightening part of these places isn't what we see, it's what we can't. The cold drafts, the distant whispers, the figures we glimpse out of the corner of our eyes. They aren't just figments of our imagination. They're something else. Something that lingers long after we leave. So, before you turn in for the night, take a moment to look around. What's in the room with you? Are you really alone? End of script. Sleep well.